The Friends have been here since 1694 in this building. Originally, they worshipped in John Bound's house a few streets away for about 30 years. And then they built this building. So they went from a house to a meeting house. And the building was very old at the time of the American Revolution. It really was 80 years old plus, and it was pretty old. Now, the British quartered their soldiers here, and they didn't want to be here. I tell the children, the school children, when they come for the tours, that the British soldiers didn't want to be here, and the people in Flushing resented them being here, as all occupying armies are always resented. They burned the benches for firewood. They were cold, lonely, no doubt, and then these benches were built after the American Revolution. So they date from about 1780 or so. It has a lot of history. There was a school here at one time, and it was open to children of all races and religions because there was no public education. Public education was very controversial. A lot of people felt that if everyone learned to read and write, they wouldn't want to work. Well, now we know that's a very selfish attitude. So this, the Friends women here, and we use the term Friends amongst ourselves. Quaker was originally a derogatory name, but it stuck. And we don't mind that it stuck. The rest of the world calls us Quakers. But amongst ourselves, we tend to use the word Friends. When this school was opened to poor children, two little boys came up from Georgia. They were mixed race. Their father was Irish. Their mother was African American. She was a slave. His father bought her freedom. Now, these children could not get an education down in Georgia. This is pre-emancipation. So they were sent up here to this very humble school that was run by the Friends women. We still have two benches upstairs that they used in the school. They were Roman Catholic. They were very good students. They became Roman Catholic priests, and one of them was a bishop in Maine, and the other one, the other brother, Patrick Healy, became the president of Georgetown University, which is quite an accomplishment for this very humble school. I've noticed over the years when I give tours that people come here for the historic building, but then they seem to feel when they leave more relaxed and comfortable, and I think it's because the building represents stability. It's a humble building, it's wood shingled, it's not brick or stone, but it has endured for more than 300 years. I think Whittier wrote, "So I find it well to come for deeper rest to this still room, for here the habit of the soul feels less the outer world's control." And I think that sums it all up.
Because I don't know.
You're not sure? But you've been here since you were 4 years old, maybe 5 years old?
I don't know what age.
So when you come, what do you do?
I usually climb this tree and I go upstairs and play with one kid usually, but she didn't come here today.
So you play upstairs. What else do you do upstairs?
I listen to stories,
Yeah, what kind of stories?
Bible.
Ah.
I'm Jerry Pollock, and I came to the meeting first in 1940 when I was 11 years old. I think that although I'm not the oldest member of the meeting today, there's no one here whose association with the meeting goes back as far as mine does. I came because my parents had come to the United States as refugees from Hitler Europe, and we landed in Sunnyside here in Queens, and they thought that I should have a bit of religious education. So they suggested that I come here for Sunday school, and that's how it all started.
We were dating at the time, and we were starting to get kind of serious and thinking about future plans. And we decided that we wanted to find, a spiritual home for our relationship and our future family. So we started sort of investigating different religious traditions. I came from a very intense Pentecostal background, and Patrick was baptized Catholic, but he had exposure to Quakers as a kid. But neither of us had been involved in any religion for years and years and years. So we started looking seriously at the Quakers, and we went to the 15th Street meeting, we came to this meeting, and we kind of went back and forth for a little while, but we found that this meeting was so peaceful, and the house was so full of history that we just started coming here regularly. And then when it came time to get married, we got married here, which was really wonderful, really, really wonderful. The room was packed full of all of our family and friends, and it was amazing. It was really powerful. To be surrounded by all that love and have people saying such wonderful things about us. And the airplanes flying overhead lent to the ambiance. Extra ambiance.
It's funny, most days I sort of sit and I think what I find so peaceful about this meeting is actually, I guess you might be able to see it out behind us. I'm sort of fascinated by how the trees change through the season out the window. I like looking out that window.
Yeah, we always sit over there so we can see out. And our wedding was in the winter, so it was beautiful here. Everything was, it was cold, and there was snow, and it was lovely. But yeah, it's sitting in this meeting house and having the gardens outside and the light and Northern Boulevard. It's an interesting study in contrast, but it does, in a lot of ways, feel like a real escape. Yeah, and you know what? I don't even hear the planes during meeting. I really don't. Or if I hear them, they're just, I sort of accept them as part of our world.
My name is Tom English, and the question is what brought me to the meeting. God brought me to the meeting, I think. I grew up in Jackson Heights, which is not too far on the number 7 train and not too far on the Q666 bus. And when I was, I guess before I was in high school, or maybe during high school, my brother Christopher and I were members of the YMCA, which is, I think it's still on this block. And we didn't end up going a whole lot to it because it was still a bus ride, and you know, we had other things to do, and I don't know. But I do remember passing by this building a lot. My mom also used to shop on in Main Street, so taking the bus, I'd see this building a lot, but I didn't really know what went on in here. I mean, I knew the history of Friends a little bit, you know, Pennsylvania and all that stuff, and religious tolerance. I didn't really know anything about silent worship, but I didn't realize that this was a working meeting house until maybe right before I came here. And the reason I came here was, I guess you can really say it's a sort of a mixture of the attacks of 2001, and also my brother Chris died that year. He died from complications of brain surgery on December 31st, 2001, and he actually went into the hospital September 12th, 2001, so sort of those two things were going on at the same time. And after he passed, I did, I guess you could call it soul searching. I mean, I wasn't really angry at God. I sort of had made peace because I saw in his suffering a holy man, and so I just decided, I thought there was, maybe I could just think about things. And before he went to the hospital, when he was in the hospital, one of my best friend's wives grew up a friend and like gave me a list of books, and I sort of put that aside. And so I started reading about, you know, maybe my brother died the last day of December 2001, so I started reading. A friend of mine sent me this book, Will the Circle Remain Unbroken, by Studs Terkel, his interviews. And I just did a lot of thinking, and I, you know, did, you know, the internet thing. There's a website called BeliefNet, which I read about Quakerism more and more. And just sort of serendipity, I was visiting friends upstate, Bennington, Vermont, and my friend's wife said, "Oh, do you want to go to a Quaker meeting that weekend?" So I went, and I loved it. I don't even really remember the ministry too much, but I just felt really great. And so I was a little skittish about going here at first. I knew it was here, and so it wasn't until maybe October of 2002 that I had the courage to walk inside the door. So that's how I got to the meeting.
Okay, well, I'm Nancy Sunshine, and I first came here, I don't quite remember, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, but my son came first. And you want to know how I got here? Well, my daughter got married quite a few years ago, and my son went to her wedding, and he was so thrilled with the wedding and all the love that was going around. He says, "Mom, I'm going to attend Quaker meeting. There's one in Flushing, isn't there?" And I said, "Yes, there is." At the time, I wasn't attending anything, but he went, and after a while, he said, you know, he encouraged me to go with him. So I did, and the first thing that struck me when I went into the meeting house was it just smelled so wonderful. You know, like years and years of people worshiping. And I love the people here too. They're all so friendly. So I just kept coming back. I find before I even joined, I started getting active. I took the minutes for the business meeting, and I took the minutes for the Ministry and Oversight Committee, and I'd gone to a couple of yearly meetings, and I was questioned about, well, why should I be holding offices here, you know, doing things for the meeting when I wasn't even a member? And I thought about that. And I thought, yeah, maybe I should join.
I'm Joan Kindler, and I'm a member of Flushing Meeting. I've been a member since 1976. I was an attender a couple of years before that, but I didn't officially become a member. Of course, the meeting attenders and members are equal. Anyone who comes to meeting for worship is considered part of the meeting for that week. And I had gone back to college as an adult with young children, and I studied comparative religions, and I was also active in the Queen's Historical Society. And so I just came to this meeting. Was one of the many different houses of worship that I visited, and it just felt like home. And I've been coming here ever since. I've been clerk of the meeting, which is, we don't have any ministers. There are some Quaker meetings that do have ministers. They're called pastoral meetings. They're mostly out in the Midwest and out California. But we're an unprogrammed meeting, which means we come together in silence, and if ever anyone feels moved to give a message, they will give that message. But it's called unprogrammed meeting. And it was that really riveted me to this meeting, was that feeling that George Fox, who was the founder of the Friends, or Quakers was a derogatory term, but we use it now proudly, felt that you didn't need an intermediary between yourself and God, that you could experience God yourself, especially when gathered together. Sort of like early Christianity when the apostles were gathered together. And Jesus said, where there are 2 or 3, even there I am. But it's a very important meeting historically too, because Flushing is considered the birthplace of religious freedom because of a document in 1657, which was written by the townspeople of Flushing to the Dutch government, which was colonizing New York, and pleading for religious freedom for the Quakers or for anyone. It's a very historic document and considered to be the birth of religious freedom, even though those people who wrote it were fired. When John Bowne built his house, he was a Quaker, and he let the Quakers worship there. He was arrested, and he made his way to Holland and got written material to present to Peter Stuyvesant, and freedom of religion was established. And it's very much like our First Amendment to the Constitution. So it was the earliest effort of a grievance by the colonists for religious liberty. There was a lot of religious turmoil in the 17th century. So it's sort of wonderful to sit in a meeting house that is over 300 years old. It's with all the airplanes overhead and urban building all about.
My name is Naomi Paz Greenberg, and what brought me originally to Quakers was, about 25 years ago, I saw something on television, the David Susskind show. He was interviewing a man by the name of Charles Clements, who was a fighter pilot in Vietnam and became a conscientious objector during his tour of duty and refused to complete his tour of duty, and came back to the United States. He was discharged on a 10% psychiatric discharge, if I recall correctly. And coming back to the United States, he decided that, I guess, to atone in some manner for the lives he had taken, he wanted to become a doctor, and so he became a doctor. And he was working in a clinic in Los Angeles when he started seeing people coming in with phosphorus burns on their bodies. And he asked them, "What happened to you? These are the wounds of war." And they told him that what was going on in El Salvador, these were all refugees from El Salvador. And so he just left his practice and went to El Salvador to heal the wounds of war. And in watching this man, I thought, this is a real hero. And David Susskind, who usually had 2 or 3 people on every program, had only him for the entire hour or hour and a half, and said, "Well, what motivates you?" and so forth and so on. And he said, "Well, I'm a pacifist and I'm a Quaker." And then shortly after that, they had a segment on 60 Minutes about the sanctuary movement, which was not exclusively Quakers, but also Quakers were involved in that. And so I said, I really do have to find out about these people. And I started attending Brooklyn meeting. That was in the 80s, in the early middle 80s. And I attended there for about 4 years and then drifted away. Moved to Queens and went about, you know, working and living my life and so forth and so on. And then September 11th happened, the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and so forth. And as a consequence of that, I saw flags sticking out of every window, and, you know, a friend of mine had a flag on her wallet, her purse, just everywhere. And I felt I have to wear a peace symbol, and I didn't have the courage to wear it. I really thought I might get beaten up on the subway or something. I really did, if I wore a peace symbol. So I thought I must find the courage to wear a peace symbol. So I came back to Quaker meeting, and I came to Flushing. And I've been here ever since.
If someone, a visitor, we had several today, were to walk in and ask, what does it mean to be a Quaker? What would you say?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it means something different just about to each friend. It's a personal experience, but that's probably true for every religion. You know, there are some outlines and parameters and perhaps the skeleton, but then the rest is personal. It's fleshed out by each individual. I think that the few things that are unique to Friends is, first of all, our manner of worship. In other words, that we listen for God instead of talking to God for the most part. Even in programmed meetings, I assume that that is the intent, although I don't know. And another thing is the way we conduct our business meeting, and our committee meetings, which is always in worship. I think that is unique to Friends. And the fact that we're a quote-unquote peace church, our peace testimony, is not unique, but it is certainly a feature of Quakerism.
To understand Quaker pacifism, you have to step back one step and say, why are we pacifists? Quakers, it's not a faith of dogma or doctrine. It's a faith of direct experience. Each of us in worship can directly experience the divine, the transcendent, the immanent within us. So we all have direct access to truth without intermediaries. And it's not just exclusively Quakers. That's true of everyone on earth. Our founder, George Fox, told us in the 1600s to walk cheerfully over the earth, seeking that of God in everyone. And he did say everyone, he didn't say every man. And the thing is that it's very hard to seek that of God in someone, find it and blow it away. You can't live that way and still be able to kill people, still be able to exploit people, torture people, enslave them, cheat them, rob them. It just doesn't work that way. And that's why Friends are pacifists. We try to live in that life and spirit that takes away the occasion of war. We try to examine our possessions to see if they contain within them the seeds of war. Those are both Quaker quotes. And so the point about pacifism is not so much that it means we won't use violence and we won't fight wars. It means everything else that we will do. We will try to live lives that are lives of simplicity, not of ascetic denial, but of simplicity, to live simply so that others can simply live. Not to base our lives on a selfishness that means that others have less so that we can have more than we need. We try to live lives so that there is a spirit of truth in everything we say and everything we do. That we respect the equality of everyone, both in God's eyes and under the law, and we try to make sure that the law, therefore, respects the equality of all. And we try to either prevent unnecessary conflict or to resolve conflict in a creative way that addresses what the genuine needs are of everyone who's involved, and find ways that don't involve violence and don't involve war to address the needs that everybody has. So that we're pacifists, not simply because mass killing is wrong and mass suffering is unnecessary. We're pacifists because there are so many other answers to the problems that face us. And that we see that all war ever does is plant the seeds of more war.
I do think that a faith is useless if you don't do anything with it. But at the same time, I don't think, I mean, a lot, sort of like our cliche is that, it's all about the peace testimony. And to be honest with you, and I've done stuff, I'm the clerk of Peace and Social Action, and I've done stuff, we vigil in front of the Armed Services Recruitment Center. But for me, it's really about being you and God. And so, like, the activism is an outgrowth of the initial encounter.
We started a little storefront after school center in the most terrible neighborhood in Flushing. Nobody knew where it was. And we asked for what they thought needed the most help, and that's what they said. I think they were testing us. So we arrived there, and there were cockroaches crawling out the walls and rats, and we decided, well, are we Quakers or are we mice? So we bustled in, cleaned it up, and we did start a nice little after-school center there for the black children. And their parents were so pleased because their kids had never been paid any attention. All kinds of wonderful things happened there. Our members all brought books for the children. They had never had their own books. And stuff like that was exciting. So that's one of the things we do.
What comes out of your faith? What place in your faith leads you to do things like that? Leads you to reach out to the people no one else does?
Oh, Jesus. He didn't go after the bankers. It might have been a good idea, but he didn't. And it was a conscious imitation of what a Christian life should be. Now, I'm not so keen on that now, because Christians do not behave very well. But that was our idea. And it was a good thing to live by, because the whole First Testament is full of examples of small acts being very significant. That's the best I can answer that.
I like the smaller points of this meeting. I think I love to look at the subtle differences in the benches. All of similar, basically the same design, and yet you get some that are narrow, like this one that I'm sitting on. There's some other ones that are a bit broader. And it reminds me of both the difference and the similarities of people who come to Friends. You know, we're all human beings. We're all very similar, and yet each one of us is different in our own little way.
In any group, it's hard if you are not forgiving of whatever things you might not like. One has to stay and work out what you don't like. And change it, if possible.
Do you have a favorite place in the meeting room?
Yeah, right here. I don't know why. I think part of it is because there's a church across the street with a cross, and it says "God loves you." I like the idea of looking at that when I'm worshiping. You know, it's a different religion, but ultimately, you know, I like the sentiment. So I like being here, and I also like I like from this bench I can see everyone coming in, and occasionally I like to count to see how many people are at worship.
When you worship, you sit here.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason that you've chosen this place in the meeting house to worship?
Yes, I like the graffiti on the seat bench in front of me. It's a peace symbol with a triangle, and if you look at it quickly, it even looks like a heart sometimes. And there's a cross, and there's a sun, a symbol of the sun reflecting the shadow of the cross on the ground in front of it. It's just all the or many of the visible symbols of peace all conflated into one by what I assume was a student sitting here when this, or just a kid sitting here when this room may have been used for a school. Or maybe this bench was in a different room, I don't know. That's why I sit here.
Your place to worship is right here. You worship right at that bench. What made you choose that bench?
Well, when my son came with me, he sat there. So I sat next to him, and you know how human nature is. We're a little bit territorial, and wherever we sit at the first time is where we tend to sit most of the time, although not every Quaker is like that. Maybe I'm, more animal than everybody else.
And you've chosen to worship there. You sit there quite often when you worship. Why did you choose that spot?
I have no idea. There's a tendency in this meeting room, when people come in the first time, wherever it is they happen to sit, that's where they keep sitting, and I have no idea why. This was the available space, and it just became where I sat. I mean, there have been occasions when I sat elsewhere, and it's actually a healthy thing to do because it literally changes your perspective. And things can literally look different to you and sound different to you if you're not in the same place in the room. But we are creatures of habit, and it's just easier to come into our accustomed place.
Well, because it is a national landmark, a city landmark, a state landmark, and on the National Historic Register, and is maybe the second oldest house of worship that has been in continuous use in this country. So I think certainly you even get a feel of the oldness, or when you're told about it being here, and the first one in New York City, New York State, and second in the nation. I mean, there might have been other meetings in people's homes, but 1694 is really an early date for it. And so it deserves to be treasured. I mean, we have to be proper stewards. It's just, we don't worship the building, but we were given this building. It's been here all these years, and so we have to act as proper stewards in the preservation of the meeting house. And so fortunately we have been able to get from the city and the state some money in matching grants.
People should care about this old house precisely because it is such an old house, and it's been home to so many people over the years.
There's also, I mean, this old house, I mean, this meeting house has been, it was one of the first buildings, I believe, that was built in Flushing. So, I mean, as Flushing changes, and, in the city, all of New York City changes all the time. But this is, to me, this is an important house because it's been a constant for a long time. So not only does it feel like an old house now in 2005, but it felt like an old house in 1930. It felt like an old house in 1830. And then, people have been coming here and going, wow, this is an old, look at this, it's been that way for a really long time. So. And you know, as I don't know. I think it's one of the things that makes it special, certainly. But I think the other thing that makes it special in terms of why you care about it is that it's not just an old building, because there are other sort of historical buildings in New York, where Walt Whitman's house and Poe's house, but this house has been. People have been coming here and worshiping in a very quiet way, consistently for years, and the worship has changed. Behind you, there's the elder benches, and people don't use the elder benches anymore. But what folks are seeking is probably very similar to what folks were seeking when they first built this house.
What do you appreciate about this building?
The smell. I really, in the summer you really can't smell it that much, but I think like after a rainstorm when it's a little moist, sort of the oldness of the building and all the stuff that's happened here before. I know as Quakers we're really not into the place. I mean, every place is supposed to be sacred, and I really totally buy that, but I mean there is there is a sense of history here. George, I don't know if George Fox himself preached here, but I know he preached, the time of John Bown, and I just think it's really cool. And sort of like, there's not a lot of us, but at least, that we're keeping the light flickering, which I think is good.
So we've sort of looked up our ancestors, and basically my ancestors back to the time of William the Conqueror, when he did that census in England, have been in the church business, which was a very profitable business for my ancestors who managed to make the transition to Anglican. And it was even pretty good for the ones who became Methodists and Baptists, but for the ones who became Quakers, there's no clergy. So they had to go into the farming business, and apparently they weren't terribly suited for that. And so they went into business, and they weren't too good with money either, so they just became poorer and poorer. And one of them married an Irish woman because he and her father and Mark Twain all belonged to something called the Brooklyn Socialist Organization, which later became the American Communist Party. And they used to meet in Brooklyn. And so this Quaker gentleman married his friend's daughter, who was Irish, but her father was a socialist, so it was sort of an unusual sort of Irish person. And furthermore, his father fled for political reasons, so he didn't come steerage. He came, and he had money when he got here. And he lost it all too because he was, didn't believe in being better than the workers. So these two poor but educated people raised 9 out of 10 children, and they were raised as Catholics, but they were made by their parents to read something like 80% of the books that the church forbade people to read because they were, there was the papal index. So, but nevertheless, they had to read all the French philosophers and all because their parents believed in that. And a promise was made by the 15-year-old bride that she would never hit the children because the husband didn't approve of that as a Quaker. So my aunt used to say when my mother got mad, she would throw things at us. And my sister has a scar when she didn't duck fast enough from a pot. She says she threw things at us because she made a promise before she was married that she would never hit the children. And so when she got angry, she said, well, I'm not going to hit you. And she threw something. And another thing was my mother was very violent towards us, and she beat us very often, and she was a perfectionist, so everything was something wrong. But when my grandfather would come over, he didn't approve of this. And so one of the things I was always beaten for was not eating certain foods, which I could not
or if eating them, gagging on them. So he would sneak these things off of my plate, and I always remembered this man years and years later, and he died when I was 3 because of that, and because he was so gentle, and because he looked at me when he talked to me, even though I was just this little kid. And so I always wondered why he was like that, and I would ask about him, and so my aunt would tell me all of these stories about some of these odd things that he had. They were not allowed to argue at mealtimes. And my grandmother loved to argue, and she was very political. So she'd get up early in the morning, and my grandfather would go off to work, and all of her grown children would be going to their jobs at different times. So she'd argue with one in the morning. The first one to get up might have been, say, a Democrat. So she would argue with him, but she would absorb what he had to say and use it against the next one, because she loved a good argument. And but at dinner time, they were expected always to be polite to one another. And if necessary, if you didn't have something nice to say, you were not to say anything at all, which was one of the things we were brought up with. And my aunt had a lot of these little sayings, which, you know, now I realize where they came from. And a lot of habits. She could not walk past a beggar without giving money. If you had money in your pocket and someone had none, you had to share it. And you never said anything, you know, like, now I hope you're not going to use this for liquor in it. You never, ever, ever did that, because it was embarrassing for the other person to beg. And you never lied. You never, and my aunt could be very, very forthright, and she would interfere in things. She was a very timid person, but if she saw somebody hitting a child, she would go right over and say something to them. Hey, you, that's not right. You know that's not right. Why are you doing this? And she would get herself into fairly dangerous situations, but people were always so shocked that they just stopped doing whatever they were doing, which was such an example of what a single individual could do, instead of just walking past all the sorts of things that shouldn't be going on. If she saw somebody crying, she would ask them why they were crying, and she never thought that this was unusual, and I didn't either, because I saw this. And I realize now this is very unusual and a very weird way to behave. So that's kind of the little Quaker things from my family. And
you spoke about centering down. What does centering down mean to you?
It's hard to describe. I guess it means being in an attitude of, I guess what you said the other day, persistent listening and obedience and openness to change. I read or heard somewhere this wonderful definition of worship being the willingness to be changed, so that it is not our actions, but actions upon us that we make ourselves available for.
A weighty friend is a Quaker who knows all about Quakerism and can answer questions, and, you know, who's really been into it for a long time. An example of a weighty friend here would be someone like Cheshire or Wendy, because they've been Quakers all their lives, practically.
You just mentioned Clearness Committee. What does a Clearness Committee do?
A Clearness Committee is, back when Quakers started, originally it started as when people wanted to marry under the care of the meeting, a group of 2 or 3 friends would be appointed to make sure there were no encumbrances, which usually meant like property issues, other, you know, maybe kids from a previous marriage, maybe an ongoing marriage. I mean, and so the sort of the term of art was, you know, you wanted to make sure that you were clear of encumbrances. So in that sense, it was maybe started out to be a little bit more of a secular idea of the seeing that in the secular world, you know, you were okay. But what it's over the past 300 or so years, it's sort of a traditional idea of becoming, when there's a major decision to be made, or maybe there's conflict, you know, you'll have your monthly meeting, appoint a clearness committee, and these are friends who will talk with you about whatever the decision is. And so it's also grown into a tradition where if you apply for membership, your monthly meeting through the ministry and council committee or ministry and council meeting will appoint a group of friends to talk with you about your ideas of membership. And so for me, we met in the meeting house and we just talked about where I was and, you know, why I wanted to be a member. I mean, it's not really like an interview because that's not the point, but that's basically, so I mean, at the end of it, we all knew that I should be a member.
Do you have a favorite Quaker writer, and why do you like that writer?
Okay. My absolute no-holds-barred favorite is John Woolman, who was a Quaker who lived in the 1700s. He kept a journal, so you really, really know not only what he was doing on the outside, but what he was experiencing on the inside. He also wrote a number of essays. When you read them, he is so insightful and sophisticated about society and how it works and how corruption works. I don't just mean corruption in the sense of someone bribing a government official, but moral corruption and how it's justified and how it's institutionalized. This is a man who traveled south to labor with slaveholders to make tender their consciences, not to berate them or to threaten them, but to help them become conscious of what they did wrong. And at the same time that he would go there, if his hospitality was dependent on slave labor, he would very politely demur and not stay with the slaveholder directly. He also refused to use metal coins because of the conditions in the mines where the metal was obtained. He refused to use blue dyed clothing. He was considered very bizarre for this, because indigo was the dye, and that was the product of slave labor. When he went to England, he wouldn't use the mail posts, the carriages that had a regular route, because of how the drivers and how the horses were treated. He just never accepted cruelty as being part of the course and part of the system. And it's such an astonishing thing to read this in an 18th century setting. He was just brilliant, and he was always spiritual. He wasn't political, and yet he was always making what amounted to political analyses. He's fantastic to read. He really is. He's amazing.
Do you have a favorite Quaker writer, and why do you like them?
A favorite Quaker writer. Can I use two? No. Howard Brinton, for sure. I mean, I read Friends for 300 Years when, you know, because I am a bit of a mystic, but I approach my spirituality. I'm a reader. I'm a little bookish, so I approach my spirituality by reading. So one of the books that my friends, you know, recommended that I read was Friends for 300 Years, and I loved it. And I also read Jim Punchin, Listening to the Light. So I would have to say, you know, those are, and you know, obviously, you know, as I learn more and more about Friends, like Douglas Steere, but I would have to say Howard Brinton if you have to pin me down. And Friends for 300 Years was, you know, one of the reasons I'm here.
And Friends for 300 Years talks about what exactly?
It's basically a history of Friends, but it's also a history of, you know, almost like a survey of different strands of Quakerism. And I remember his his, especially toward the end of the book, his basic thesis or his basic idea how there's always been, because of the silence, there's a trend, there's a strand of quietism, but at the same time, there's a sense that you have to make the kingdom of God now. So there's a sense of social activism, and how those are sort of one aspect of the same coin, but in different parts of Quaker history. There was one of them that was maybe ascendant. Maybe like in the 19th century, at least the late 19th century, there was more an idea of quietism, whereas more about the silence and maybe sort of being a community that's peculiar, and that maybe a lot of the people he didn't, his book was written in the 50s, so he couldn't really speak to like the Vietnam War, but a lot of friends became friends because of the social activism aspect of it. But he was saying that they're really aspects of the same thing.
And so what stories were coming to mind?
Well, my favorite is we were doing a lot of mingling with black people wherever we could, because they were shunned in this community, and we in so doing that, a lot of interesting things happened, and we got very much into Martin Luther King's movement. And I remember going with Quaker friends to Washington to demonstrate several times. We went regularly as long as there was a need. And they tried to scare us, oh, you don't want to do that. That's a bunch of Reds. They must have been doing something right. That's the right thing to do. So we went. There were 3 of us then, very, very close friends. And of course, we didn't see any communists. I'm sure there were communists there, but we didn't see any. And if we did, I don't think it would make much difference. But what we did see was hundreds of people from probably thousands, little towns, little churches. They were almost all what I call come to Jesus Christians, conventional Christians. So that was amazing. Well, then Martin Luther King died. And that was, of course, an utter disaster for everybody. And my 3 friends and I had been going, there's a little black church only a block away. And the reverend there used to be the Reverend Timothy Mitchell, who was a known activist, very interesting man. And so the 3 of us just decided to integrate the Abyssinian Baptist Church. So over we went in our Sunday best, looking as conventional as all hell. And we timidly went up the steps, and Reverend Mitchell had a booming voice. Well, look here, look who's come to Jesus. And we felt so accepted. That really wasn't our idea, but it felt very much accepted. And from then on, we were wonderful friends. We'd go once a month. Well, when Martin Luther King died, then what were we supposed to do? The whole country was in a raging revenge mood, and especially black people in the ghettos. So what should we do? We felt that we needed to express our sorrow because he was quite a wonderful person, in person. And so the Sunday after he died, we talked it over, and we were shaking because they were killing people in revenge and anger, and they had every right to. Not that that's ever right, but if it was, that would be it. So, holding hands, we went the block and a half. And when we got to the door, we started shaking and turning away. And I said, no, you have to be brave. This was a wonderful man, and we have every right to mourn him. So we knocked on the door very timidly, and the Reverend threw the door open and said, well, look here. Look who's come to mourn Martin with us. What do you think of that? And I can remember all the heads turning, looking at Whitey standing at the doorway. It was drama. So he said, come in, sisters. Come in, sisters. Make yourself comfortable and share our terrible grief. So we did. And you could feel the congregation just thinking it over and saying, well, you know, they didn't have to come. And they must be really decent people. So that was the sort of thing that we did. It's a very beautiful memory to have, you know, because it was very thrilling.